Our Bible reading is from Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 to 11. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with a colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those who followed him shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowd answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee."
So this is a story of Palm Sunday. We often look at Palm Sunday a little bit as if people heard crowds cheering and so they just joined in and waved palm branches. And then a few days later they heard people shouting "Crucify," so they just joined in and shouted "Crucify." That they were just a fickle crowd and they were going along with whatever was going at the time. But it's not how the story is. There is so much more to this story. Firstly, we read in John chapter 11 that Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. He'd been dead 4 days, and then Jesus called him forth from the tomb. And this was the most amazing thing. And because of it, many Jews believed in Jesus. Pharisees weren't quite so happy. John 11:47, they say, "Here is the man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away our temple and our nation." So he'd really stirred things up, because many had seen Jesus heal, they'd seen him cast out demons, they'd seen him provide food when there was very little or none. And now they've seen him raise someone from the dead. He must be the Messiah. Who else could do that? I mean, just imagine if something like that happened in our town, that someone was buried and 4 days later someone called them out of the tomb and they came back alive, and it would cause a huge stir. There'd be many who would be just awestruck, while many would say, "Oh, it's all a hoax. There was no one in the coffin anyway." But whatever, it would still be a huge stir. But this was also a time of Passover. And at Passover, Jews would come from all over Israel and all over other lands to be in Jerusalem for Passover. And the historian Josephus tells us there could be up to 2 million people in Jerusalem at that time. So the whole place was a buzz and a stir. And it's into this atmosphere that Jesus makes a very deliberate step. He sent his disciples into the next village. He told them to get a donkey with a colt. If anyone was to ask them, "What are you doing?" they were simply to say, "The master needs it." And we tend to think that Jesus must have had this prearranged, but not necessarily so. There was a well-entrenched understanding in the Jewish culture that if the king wanted a beast of burden, he could simply commandeer it. There was also an understanding that no one but the king would ride the king's donkey. So they had to get a donkey that had not been ridden, and of course then no one else would be allowed to ride it. When the disciples found the donkey, they said, "The master needs it." Now, the word used is kurios, which can be translated master, lord, or the sovereign one. So what was happening here is that they were making a kingly claim on the donkey, and they were to get a donkey that had never been ridden, and so it was a colt. And you can see that it was a young donkey by the fact that they brought the mother along with it, which is very sensible. This was a deliberate act of Jesus, coming to the city and to the temple. He was coming to claim his kingdom. He rode the young donkey down from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. He was coming as their rightful king. There's a quote from Zechariah 9:9. "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Knowing all that Jesus had done, seeing him raise Lazarus from the death, these people believed, here comes our coming Messiah. Now we can understand this, or we can see this is what it really was, by the fact that they were waving the palm branches. And to understand this, we need to go back in history. In the 300s BC, Alexander the Great conquered that whole area right through what's now modern day Iran. He imposed the Greek culture, the Greek language, and the Greek religion on this area to try and keep it in subjugation. After his death, it was split into 4, but there was still Greek rule. The area that was ruled in the 100s BC, the area of Israel that was ruled in 100 BC, was by a man named Antiochus IV. Antiochus called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the Epiphanes meaning God is manifest. But the Jews named him Antiochus Epimanes, which means madman. He was Antiochus the madman, and I think they were probably more correct. During his time, his reign, he offered pig's flesh on the altar, and he offered it to the god Zeus. And he turned the temple cubicles into a brothel. And this was the absolute final straw for the Jews, and they rebelled. They rebelled under Judas Maccabeus. The rebellion was successful, and for 3 years Israel was free of foreign rule, but they also were able to cleanse and rededicate the temple. Now every year this rededication of the temple was remembered, and in remembering it they had a festival they called the Festival of Lights, which is now called Hanukkah. And what they would do at this festival is they would grab palm branches and they would march around the altar, which was the thing that had been cleansed. And the palm fronds stood for victory. In ancient times, often a conquering athlete would be given a palm branch rather than a wreath as a sign of victory. So they're remembering the victory of driving the Greeks out of Israel and restoring the temple. The cry Hosanna simply means God save us. On the day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem, the crowd believed he was the Messiah. He'd come to rid them of the foreign repression. They were seeing him as another Judas Maccabeus. They lay their cloaks on the road in front of the donkey, symbolic of laying their lives before the king. But there's also an Old Testament precedent for this as well. We know that Ahab was a very wicked king and God wanted to get rid of him. He told the prophet Elijah, go send one of your junior prophets to a commander named Jehu and anoint him as king. And so this other prophet went to Jehu and took him inside on his own, anointed him as king, and then left. And then when Jehu went outside and his officers were sitting around on the steps outside, they said, well, what did that guy want? Oh, he's just anointed me as king. But then we read in 2 Kings 9:13, they quickly took off their cloaks, spread them on the steps under him, and they blew the trumpet and shouted, Jehu is king. So this crowd on Palm Sunday was not just a fickle crowd. This crowd was proclaiming Jesus as king. But it was a crowd that didn't really understand. Jesus was not coming as the conquering hero to overthrow Rome. He was coming to cleanse the temple. And this time, the temple wasn't to be cleansed from pagan defilement. It was to be cleansed from the Jews' own defilement. My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Jesus passed judgment on the worship of his people. Their worship, he said, was hollow. The day after, and this wasn't in the reading, but the day after, Jesus passed a fig tree, all covered in leaves. He went up to it, he didn't find any fruit. And so he put a curse on the fig tree and said, you will never have fruit. And the very next day the tree had withered. But this was symbolic. The fig tree was often used as a symbol of Israel. And what it's saying is Israel looked good, they looked like they were being godly, everything on the outside, but they were not bearing any fruit. Jesus, the King of Peace, came in judgment on his own people. That's why the crowd turned so quickly. He wasn't what they were hoping for. Jesus was coming into Jerusalem as a king, but it was to be a kingship of heart and mind. The temple was no longer to be the dwelling place of God. Jesus was God, and the dwelling place is now all the people who invite him into their lives. He was coming to claim his kingdom. He comes today as King. He comes to us. He comes as a King of peace. He wants to make a claim on our lives. He wants worship from the heart. Going through motions of worship, if the heart's not in it, if our daily lives don't reflect our devotion to Jesus, is absolutely abhorrent to God. Remember the message of the prophet Amos. I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice flow like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. He wants lives that bear fruit for him. Jesus comes to us as King. He wants to bring us into his kingdom. But are we willing to accept the sort of King that he is?